Welcome back, everyone. This week we're looking at the extirpation of idolatry, or the institution that was known as the extirpation of idolatry. And we've talked about the evangelization methods of the early mendicant friars, so the orders that were known as the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, and I also mentioned the Mercedarians, although we didn't really talk about them, and how they, broadly speaking, represented the Hispanic religious mentality between 1492 up to 1565 in the Americas, this is. So in this session, or in this week, these two sessions, there's going to be two recordings, we'll be linking that earlier period with events and mentalities post 1565 in both New Spain, so that's Mesoamerica, and Peru, which is the Andean region. And I'll also be setting the European context for the changes that happened and also the continuities that existed round about this period in order to understand the phenomenon which I've mentioned is known as the extirpation of idolatry. And we'll do it in two sections. The first section I'll take you through the necessary context both in Europe and the Americas, while in the second we'll look at specific case studies. So okay, this is going to be the context. Now, last time we discussed creative approaches and dynamism of the early evangelization period. So the search for ways to explain Christianity to indigenous Americans in ways they might better understand. So by using symbols, art forms, language drawn from indigenous traditions. Now, of course, as we mentioned, these processes didn't always bring about the understanding that was intended, and often led to significant misunderstandings because words, forms, practices, they were appropriated and reinterpreted by both sides. And a lot could be and was indeed lost, or at least transformed, in translation. And this was soon seen to be a big problem by some, and I stress some, not all, religious authorities who were concerned about how Catholicism, which was considered by them to be universal, might be changed or, from their perspective, corrupted. So, let's slides on. Added to which, as part of this process of conversion, violence and trauma was unfortunately sometimes involved. And as an example, some Spanish clergy and their converts, drawing from methods used in Northern Europe in the early Middle Ages, engaged in the deliberate destruction of indigenous shrines in order to replace them with Christian places of worship. So you can see, for example, this image of Saint Boniface, who was an English missionary sent to Frisia, and he chopped down a sacred oak in front of a whole load of Vikings, and not surprisingly, they didn't like it, and they buried an axe in his head, or a sword, according to this image. Yeah, so you can see that this kind of methodology of destroying indigenous or pagan shrines with and then replacing them with Christian shrines it's a tried and tested methodology. And this was also something that took place in the Americas. But sometimes this process was relatively peaceful and organic, with if that's the right word to use, with the focus of worship of indigenous deities with certain attributes being transferred to the veneration of particular Christian saints with similar attributes, or perceived to have similar attributes. So one very, very important example is a grassroots indigenous devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe. So this is an aspect of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And this Guadalupe appeared on, or close to the shrine in the location of the indigenous goddess Tonantzin. Now, I've said it's a grassroots devotion because, according to the legend or the documentation, it originated with a vision by an indigenous Christian named Juan Diego. She appeared to Juan Diego and told him to go and speak to the bishop. This was Juan de Zumárraga. He went to speak to the bishop, and the bishop said, "Don't be silly, go back home," or words to that effect. And he went back home, and Our Lady appeared to him again, a little bit irritated the fact that the bishop hadn't agreed to build a shrine for her. And he said, "Well, I can't do anything until he wants proof." So Our Lady Santa Maria de Guadalupe, she says, "All right, gather up all these flowers that you'll find on the hill in your cloak and take them to the bishop." And when he took them to the bishop, he opened his cloak. There was a miraculous image of Our Lady of Guadalupe imprinted on the cloak, and that's the image you can see here, which is now framed and in the shrine of Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe. Yeah, and it is an image of the Immaculate Conception. And by the way, this isn't referring to the virgin birth, or it is referring to the fact that Mary was conceived without sin. Anyway, that's a tangent. So yeah, what's important here for us now is that it was a grassroots devotion, and according to the documentation, it was initially resisted by the Spanish authorities. But by the mid-17th century, when it was actually put down in writing, it had become one of the most important Catholic devotions in the Americas. And Our Lady de Guadalupe, Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, is to this day considered the patron saint of the Americas. So yeah, a very, very important devotion for Hispanic American Christians, Catholics rather. The evangelicals don't think she's particularly important. But anyway, so the method of appropriating indigenous sacred spaces, and that's officially by the authorities as well as by ordinary indigenous Christians, this is a method used throughout the Americas. And just to give you a few particular examples, there's a couple here famous, a couple less so perhaps. You've got the Cathedral of Mexico City. This is the most prominent building of the Plaza Mayor. This is the main square. And you can see the cathedral there. Well, that was built right on top of the site of the Mexica Templo Mayor of Tenochtitlan. So remember the video that I showed you in which you saw the temple of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. There's a dual temple that with all those steps. It's the great temple. So this cathedral was built on that site. The building was begun in 1525, but this current construction that you can see here began in the 1570s, possibly the 1560s, and it was finally completed nearly 100 years later in 1667. So that's the Templo Mayor in Mexico City. Well, in Peru, similarly, in 1535, the Dominican order appropriated the Inca's most sacred site. This is the Temple of the Sun, known as Coricancha, and you can see how the Dominican convent, so this is Spanish architecture, you can see the Spanish brickwork here, sits right on top of the Incaic stonework. You can see the Inca walls here. So the convent sits on top of the Inca structure. So if we move back to Mesoamerica, roughly the same time as the Dominican convent of Coricancha was set up in Cusco, in Cholula, which is near Tlaxcala and now the city of Puebla, a church dedicated to Mary was built on the top of the main temple pyramid. And you can see here the temple's been partially excavated, but the structure of the pyramid remains intact underneath the soil and the trees, and the Temple of Mary is at the very top. So if these of themselves, these top-down actions, they didn't always provoke recorded indigenous reactions in themselves. So we don't know if they provoked indigenous reactions because nothing has been recorded. And in the case of these three constructions mentioned, there really is no record of any uprisings as a direct result of the construction of Christian temples on these sites. But, and this is important, at the same time this process could be particularly traumatic and could provoke violent responses. For example, if you have missionaries and worse still, I suppose, newly Christianized teenagers, boys, traveling around and smashing deities, or from the point of view of the Christians, idols, that either belong to their own or other communities, and you shouldn't be surprised if this did actually provoke a violent reaction. And as just a couple of examples, we've got the boy martyrs of Tlaxcala. So the first you can see here, this is Cristobal, and he was killed by his own father, Axcotecatl, and he was killed in 1527 because he kept destroying the father's stores of alcoholic drink, which were used in indigenous rituals. He'd really taken on board what the friars were teaching about idolatry, and he'd really interiorized Christianity to the extent that he was trying to stop his father carry out indigenous rituals. And his father, after progressively reprimanding him more and more severely, eventually killed him. You also have 2 years later the boys Juan and Antonio, who were killed in 1529. So the Dominicans asked the Franciscans if they could lend them two boys that could assist them in their evangelization attempts, and off they went. And the boys themselves really got into it and were killed by a community they were supposedly evangelizing, when in fact the reason they were killed was because they were entering people's houses, the community's houses and religious centers, and destroying their household and community deities, or their idols. So yeah, the thing is, the missionaries weren't always surprised when this sort of behavior did provoke a violent reaction. In this case of the boys, they were surprised and they were really shocked. And in Motolinia's account, which is in your reading list, both the Franciscans and the Dominicans did appear to deeply regret the deaths of these boys. But when missionaries themselves were killed, there seems to be a different way of looking at it. Although you get differences depending on the type of document that they are. So for example, if they're letters that are talking about governance, if they're letters talking about pragmatic things, then you do see a sense of shock and also deep regret, mourning. But in the discourses, in the hagiographical discourses, so the religious writings, what you see is a framework in which the missionaries saw that the action of evangelization could result in their deaths, and that it could be viewed as a good thing, because martyrdom, according to the discourses, according to the rhetoric, would, and you see this quite frequently in the documentation, irrigate the land with holy blood, and as a result bear fruit. So the hagiographies, and what I mean by hagiographies is a particular style of biography that's written after the death of someone considered to be a saint or considered that they should be a saint. So these accounts of the lives and deaths of these missionaries seem to even indicate that irrigating the land with the blood of the martyrs was actually necessary to bear fruit and produce a harvest. So without it, Christianity wouldn't flourish. This is clearly an allegory or a metaphor, but at the same time, it neatly encapsulates a prominent mindset of the time. And the broader framework for this mindset is one of conflict. Now, I'm not talking about conflict between Spaniards and indigenous people, which you might immediately think of, but rather this is between the devil and those who supported him, and God and his supporters. It's a spiritual conflict. So, okay, you might ask, well, how does this relate to the material world? Well, if you believe in a universal truth like the Spanish did, and that universal truth is that there's only one God, and that he was responsible for all creation, and that to worship anything else as God was a serious sin, then there's a big problem after the conquest of the Americas, because here you've got millions of people who are either considered to be worshipping the devil, or they're simply worshipping an object. And that's believed to be on the instigation of the devil. So the devil's telling them to do this. So at best, this is a category mistake, or at worst, it's evidence of a diabolical pact on a massive scale. And so the question was how to persuade the indigenous Americans that this is in fact the case, that they were making serious category mistakes that could cost them their souls and lead them to eternal damnation. Of course, they've got to understand what souls are as well. This image here, this is from Peru, 17th century Peru. Sorry, 18th century Peru. But note the image here, which is the Virgin of the Apocalypse. So you'll see her mentioned in Revelation, who is also understood to be the Immaculate Conception. And that is in fact the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which I mentioned in Mexico. So you can see that by this time, in the 18th century, her devotion has spread to Peru. Also remember the image I showed you of St. Michael with the flaming sword and the Blessed Sacrament chaining the devil. Again, he's doing this in Revelation. And remember the one you saw from Macau, where the devil was a book, the Buddhist sutras. Here, this is a much more traditional image of the seven-headed Hydra that is mentioned in the book of Revelation. So this is an image taken from the book of Revelation. So yeah, the Spanish perspective was that indigenous people engaged in traditional indigenous religious rites were at worst committing an idolatrous category at best committing an idolatrous category mistake, and at worst engaging in a diabolical pact. Now it's worth bearing in mind that during this in order to understand this, it's worth bearing in mind that during this period there's also been a shift in theological thinking from emphasis on the seven deadly sins, which have been really prominent throughout the medieval period and up to the beginning of the 16th century, to the Ten Commandments. So now, instead of emphasizing the seven deadly sins, you have an emphasis on the Ten Commandments. Both are part of Christian tradition, but now there's a kind of shift in emphasis. And of course, the first of the Ten Commandments is, "You shall worship no God but me." So, if the very fundament of your worldview places this as rule number one, then it has to be something that's taken very seriously. And that has particular consequences for how things would develop in the Americas. As well as this, we should also keep in mind another historical development back in Europe in order to try and help understand decisions that were taken in the Americas and why these things, I suppose, if you in a manner of speaking, turned sour not long after the 1560s. The particular development that had a huge impact on the history of Europe in this period, and indeed wherever Europe went in the world, was of course the Protestant Reformation. And by contrast, or kind of counterpoint to that, was the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which arguably had been building up for a number of years until Martin Luther nailed his so-called 95 Thesis to the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg in Germany in 1517. Now, I don't have time at all to go into a detailed history of the European Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, but for our purposes here, it's important to note that it had very profound implications on the development of the history of Western Europe and the Americas, in part because of the conflict it produced over the course of the 16th century, but also because of the legacy of that conflict. Now, the Catholic world, largely under the instigation of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was also Charles I of Spain, convened the Council of Trent between the years 1545 to 1563. And he did this to decide on much needed reforms. Nobody doubted that reforms were needed, but also to work out an official response to the Protestant movement. Now, to begin with, there were a significant number of important clerics who argued for tolerance and who also argued that the damage wasn't irreparable. They weren't talking in terms of a fundamental schism. And you can compare that with parallel attitudes at the same time in the Americas with humanist missionaries who thought Christianity could be taught to indigenous people by using the cultural practice they thought to be worthy or good, in inverted commas, or of value. But by the late 1550s, things have become particularly polarized. You see a progressive polarization of two sides. And the voices of those who argue for tolerance and accommodation become much fewer and harder to hear, in part through persecution. Now, as word filters over to the Americas about Protestantism, by the mid-16th century, uneasiness is starting to grow about continuing pagan practices, even though people have been baptized and have been supposedly receiving catechesis, that's teaching in Christianity, for a number of years, or decades even. Controversy begins to grow as differing opinions are put forward. So either the indigenous peoples just aren't, so this isn't my perspective, this is the kind of arguments that were being put forward, either the indigenous peoples aren't capable of understanding, or they must be willfully resisting. And the more time passed, the fewer were those who could argue that it would just be a question of time. Because if it were just a question of time, why weren't they getting it? What they weren't thinking, though, that it was necessary to grade their assessment based on the region and also the amount of contact that indigenous peoples had had with indigenous missionaries and teaching pedagogy. So the dynamic and open practices that sought to incorporate indigenous cultural expressions into Christianity, and which were first developed by the mendicants, began to be prohibited as unorthodox and un-Catholic, in line with the much less flexible dogmas coming out of the Council of Trent. So bishops' councils were held in both Mexico and Lima to see how Trent's rulings, or dogmas if you like, should be translated and implemented in accordance with local circumstances. So if particular practices had been taken from indigenous religions, they were more and more being understood as having been diabolically inspired. Okay, so that's the context, and that's where we'll leave this part, and we'll come back to the case studies in the next part.